When the deputy asked the three Calder children who else lived in that cabin, all three gave the same answer, and the name they spoke belonged to someone who, by every record in Lott County, could not have been alive to give it. He wrote the name down anyway. He wrote it 3 times, once for each child, in 3 separate rooms, because that was the procedure, and because he did not yet understand that the procedure was the only thing holding him steady. Later he would say that the writing was the easy part. It was the matching that he could not put down. 3 children who had been kept apart since the moment they came down off the ridge, who could not have spoken to one another, who did not even seem to like one another, and every one of them had offered the same name and the same small, specific things about the person it belonged to. The way that person sat, the thing that person carried, what that person had said recently to each of them. The deputy's name was Roy Mercer, and the report he typed that week sits today in a gray folder in the basement of the Lott County Courthouse, in a row of boxes that were never meant to be opened again. For a long time, almost nobody knew it was there. The woman who found it was a county clerk named Marion Webb, and she was not looking for anything strange. She was looking for nothing at all, which is the way most strange things get found. The county had finally been given a grant to scan its old records, decades of births and deeds and court filings going soft in the damp, and the work had fallen to her because she was the one who did not complain about the basement. She had a cart, a scanner, and a list, and she went box by box down the rows the way you eat something you don't want to taste, fast and without looking. The box was marked only with a year and a case number, and the case number had a letter after it that she had never seen on any other file. When she lifted the lid, the folder inside had been closed with a paper seal across the flap, the kind a court applies when it does not intend for a thing to be read, and the seal had been signed by a judge who had been dead for many years. She told herself it was nothing. Sealed files were sealed for ordinary reasons: custody, minors. The county was full of small sorrows that the law had decided were nobody's business. But she noticed her hands had gone still on the lid, and she did not lift the folder out right away. She would say afterward that the basement felt different around that one box, though she knew how foolish that sounded, and she said it only to people she trusted not to laugh. What she could not stop noticing was the weight of it, not the literal weight. A folder is a folder. It was the number of times it had been handled. The corners were soft as cloth. Someone had taken that file out again and again over the years and read it and put it back and sealed it and taken it out again. A file that no one was supposed to open had been opened more than almost any other file in that basement. That was the first thing about the Calder case that did not make sense to her, and it would not be the last. She did not open it that day. She wrote the case number on her hand so she would not forget it, and she went home, and she did not sleep especially well, and in the morning she came back down to the basement before anyone else was in the building. That detail mattered to her later, that she had wanted to be alone with it, as if she already knew it was the kind of thing you do not read in front of other people. What she read over the next several mornings was the record of 11 months in 1977 and 1978, kept by men and women who were trained to write plainly and who, page by page, stopped being able to. The handwriting in the margins changes. The early notes are clipped and procedural. The later ones are not. Somewhere in the middle of that folder, the people writing it had clearly stopped trying to explain what they were seeing and started simply recording it, the way you write down the words of a dream before it goes, knowing it will not make sense and writing it anyway. To understand any of it, you have to go back to that late winter, to a hollow that most people in Lott County could not have found if you handed them a map, and to the 3 children who were carried down out of it into a world that did not have a place to put them. The county that holds Calder Hollow is the kind of place that has more graves than residents, and most of the residents are related to most of the graves. Collie is the county seat, a single main street with a courthouse at one end and a feed store at the other, and in 1977 it was already a town that the young were leaving. The hills above it are steep and close, folded one behind another, and between them run the narrow creek valleys the locals call hollows, each one its own small country. Some of them hold a road and a few houses. Some of them hold one house. Some of them, by then, held nothing but a chimney standing in the brush where a house used to be, and the people who had lived there gone north for factory work or gone into the ground. Calder Hollow held the Calders, and the Calders had not been seen in town in a very long time. This was not by itself alarming. That is the thing outsiders never quite grasp about that country. A family could go a year without coming down and longer, and it meant only that they had what they needed up there and no reason to walk out for more. Self-sufficiency was not strange, it was respected. A man who kept to his own hollow and asked nothing of anybody was, if anything, admired. And so the silence from Calder Hollow had been read, for years, as a kind of virtue, when it should have been read as a kind of warning. Because there were children up there, and nobody in Lott County could have told you their names, or how many there were, or that they existed at all. The man who first felt that something was wrong was not an investigator. He was a male contractor named Estill Combs, who ran a rural route that came no closer to the hollow than the mouth of Hare's Run, 3 miles down. He had no business with the Calders and no mail for them. What he had was a memory, an old one, of a standing arrangement from years back, where a member of that family would come down to the bottom of the run a few times a year and leave a few things and take a few things and exchange a word or two with whoever was passing. It was the only thread that connected that hollow to the rest of the world, and it was thin, and Estill Combs was perhaps the only person alive who would have noticed when it went slack. He noticed that he had not seen anyone from up the run in longer than he could account for. He could not have said how long, exactly. That was what unsettled him. It was the kind of absence you only feel once you go looking for the last time you remember it being filled and find that you cannot. He sat on it through the worst of the winter, the way people in that country sit on things, telling himself it was not his place, but it worked on him. And on a gray morning when the snow had gone to hard crust in the shadows and to mud in the light, he stopped at the county building in Collie on his way through, and he said to whoever would listen that somebody ought to go up Calder Hollow and just have a look, because he had a feeling, and he was sorry to be a bother about a feeling. The man who drew that errand was Deputy Roy Mercer, and he did not want it. He would say so, later and plainly. It was a long drive to the foot of a hollow and a longer walk up a trace that no vehicle could climb on the strength of a mail carrier's hunch to knock on the door of a family famous for wanting no one to knock. He expected to walk up, find smoke in the chimney and a hard look from whoever answered, apologize, and walk back down. He expected the most ordinary thing in the world. He did not find the most ordinary thing in the world, but that is getting ahead of the file, and the file is careful, even where the men who kept it were not. So we will be careful too. We will go up the way Roy Mercer went up slowly, not knowing yet what waits in the clearing at the top, because the not knowing is the only honest way to tell it. The people who lived it did not get to know the ending first, neither should we. What we can say, standing here at the mouth of the run with the whole thing still ahead of us, is the one fact that the entire 11 months would circle and never close. 3 children were brought down out of that hollow, and when they were asked who had been up there with them, they named a 4th, and they spoke of that 4th as though the question itself were strange, as though anyone could see that this person was simply part of the household, present and recent and real. By the time the investigators were finished, they would have a very good idea of who that 4th person had been. What they could never explain was how the children could have known. To understand how 3 children could be living in a hollow that no one in the county had walked into for years, you have to understand the hollow, and to understand the hollow you have to understand that the Calders had not always been hidden. They had hidden themselves deliberately over 2 generations, and the hiding was the most ordinary part of the whole story. That is the part that frightened the investigators most once they understood it. Nothing supernatural was required to make a family disappear in that country. All that was required was that the family want to, and that the rest of the world be willing to let them. The Calders came into the hollow in the 1880s, when the timber companies were buying the ridges, and a man could still claim a blind valley nobody else wanted. Calder Hollow was a valley nobody else wanted. It is a steep, dead end cut off the upper reach of Hare's Run, narrow at the mouth and narrower as it climbs, with walls so close and so wooded that the sun reaches the cabin clearing for only a few hours even in summer. Fog pools at the bottom of it in the cold months and does not burn off. The creek that runs through it is small and cold and tea-colored from the leaves, and it goes underground partway up into the rock and comes out lower down, so that there is a stretch of the hollow where you can hear water and not find it. The first Calder built there because the land was free and defensible and his. Those were good enough reasons in 1880. They became the family's whole inheritance. For the first 40 or 50 years, the Calders were not strange at all. They were in the county records like anyone. They appear in an early census, a married couple and a long row of children, the way mountain families were. They show up on a church roll down at the mouth of the run. There are deeds, a marriage or two, the small paper trail of people who are part of the world even when they live at the edge of it. A man who knew the family in those years, interviewed by the social worker decades later, remembered the Calders as quiet and hardworking and proud, quick to help a neighbor raise a barn and slow to ask for help in return. There was nothing in them, he said, that would have told you what was coming. He said that, and then he was quiet for a while, and then he said it again, as though he needed to be believed. The man who said it was named Burl Sizemore, and he was the oldest living person in Collie when Della Frost found him, well past 90, kept in a back room of his daughter's house at the edge of town, and he was the last human being alive who could say he had known the Calders before they closed the road. Frost went to him late in the investigation, when she had given up on documents and started chasing memory, and the file preserves their conversation in her even hand, and it is one of the few warm things in the whole folder, an old man and a tired woman in a small room, talking about people who were gone. Sizemore had been a boy when the Calders were still a family like any other, and he remembered them the way you remember the weather of your childhood, in fragments, without dates. He remembered helping raise a barn up some hollow when he was small, and being given bread by a Calder woman with flour still on her hands, and he remembered Elias, who would have been a young man then, as the one who worked hardest and laughed least. He remembered mostly that there had been a great many of them, that the Calder cabin had been loud with children, and that this was the thing that made what came after so strange to him, because he had watched, across his long life, a loud family go quiet, one leaving at a time, one death at a time, until the loudness was all gone, and only the quiet was left, and then the quiet closed the road behind itself, and that was the end of his knowing them. Frost asked him the question she asked everyone, whether he had ever heard in all those years of a Calder who did not leave, a Calder who stayed when the others went, and Burl Sizemore, very old, thought about it for a long time, and said a thing that Frost wrote down word for word, and that she clearly did not know what to do with, because it sat in her notes without comment, which was not like her. He said that the strange thing about the Calders, the thing people in Collie used to say when he was young, back when the family was still a family, was that they did not seem to grieve right. That when a Calder died, the others did not carry on the way people did not weep at the church or wear it on their faces in town. They went quiet, and they went home up the hollow, and a while later they would speak of the dead one in a way that unsettled people, not as gone, but as moved. As if the dead had only stepped deeper into the family rather than out of it. Folks thought it was hardness, Sizemore said, or pride, the Calder way of bearing things. But there had been a saying about them when he was a boy that he had not thought of in 70 years until Frost asked, and he gave it to her, and it is in the file, and it is the only piece of the family's own folklore that ever reached the outside world. People used to say of that family that a Calder never left the hollow. Not in life and not after. They just went down to the cellar to wait their turn to be needed. Frost wrote that down, and under it she wrote only that Mr. Sizemore was very old and that his memory of the saying could not be confirmed, which was true, and which was also the sound of a careful woman backing away from a thing she had just heard and wished she had not. She thanked him and left. He died that same year before the file was sealed, the last man who had known the Calders out loud, and the saying he carried for 70 years went into the folder, and then into the dark with everything else. What came was grief, the way it so often is in these stories, and then something colder than grief that grew in the place grief left. The turn began in the 1930s, with a death the family was said never to speak of, and a land matter that went bad at the same time. The details are thin, because the people who would have known are gone, and because the Calders themselves stopped telling anyone anything. What the investigators were able to piece together, from courthouse records and from the long memories of the oldest people in Collie, was that the family lost someone and lost a piece of the lower hollow in a sale they felt was a theft, and that the two losses braided together into a single grievance that hardened over the years into a refusal. A refusal of the county, a refusal of the church, a refusal, finally, of the road itself. Because there had been a road once, or near enough to one. The overgrown trace that climbs the ridge above Hare's Run had been a logging road, graded for mule teams, wide enough to bring a wagon most of the way up. By the 1970s it was a green tunnel, the cut still visible under the brush if you knew to look, but grown so close that a man had to turn his shoulders to pass in places. The family had not maintained it. The family had let it close on purpose, the way you let a wound close over a splinter, and the closing of that road is the single clearest thing the investigators ever found about the Calder's intent. You do not let your only road grow shut by accident. You let it grow shut because you have decided that nothing is ever coming up it again, and that nothing inside is ever meant to come down. The man who presided over that closing was Elias Calder. Elias is the figure the whole family contracts to in the file because he is the last of them anyone outside the hollow can clearly remember, and because the deputy and the doctor and the social worker all came to feel that whatever the children were living inside of, Elias had built it. He had been a young man at the time of the death and the bad sale, and he took the grievance and made it a way of life. The few accounts of him that survive describe a tall, spare, courteous man who would speak to you civilly at the mouth of the run and let you understand, without a hard word, that you were not to come any farther. He paid no taxes that the county could ever successfully collect. He sent no child to any school. He buried his own dead, somewhere up in that hollow, in ground no investigator was ever shown. He kept, as far as anyone could tell, no calendar and no clock, and he answered to no authority but his own. And over the decades the county simply gave up on him, the way you give up on a tooth that has stopped hurting because the nerve has died. And here is the first thing in the file that does not sit right, the first of many, and the investigators caught it early and could never make it lie down. Nobody could say for certain when Elias Calder died. There is no death record, there is no grave the county was ever shown. There is a strong belief among the older people of Cawley that the old man had been dead for some years by 1977, that he had passed somewhere in the early part of the decade, because the man who used to come down to the mouth of the run in his later years simply stopped coming, and the figure occasionally glimpsed at a distance afterward seemed wrong for him, too small, too slight. But belief is not a date. The county had let Elias Calder live outside its records for so long that when he left the world, he left it outside the records too, and no one could fix the year. He had made himself unaccountable in life, and so his death went unaccounted as well. That uncertainty, a small administrative blank, an old man with no date on him, would become the crack the entire case fell into. Hold on to it. The investigators did not understand its importance until very late, and by then it was the most important thing in the folder. Because if you cannot say when a man died, you cannot say for certain that he is dead. After Elias, the household passed to a woman the records can barely hold. Her name was Verna Calder, and whether she was his daughter or the wife of a son who died or left, the documents disagree, and the disagreement is not the kind that gets resolved. One fragment of paper makes her one thing, a second-hand memory makes her another. She is the mother or the mother's place, the woman who was running that cabin when the children were in it, and she is the great absence at the center of the discovery, because when the deputy reached the clearing, Verna Calder was not there. She has never been accounted for. The children spoke of her, but they did not speak of her the way you speak of someone in the next room. They spoke of her the way you speak of weather that has already passed, and they spoke far more and far more readily of the fourth. But the search for Verna comes later. Here, at the family's history, what matters is only this. By the middle 1970s, Calder Hollow held a woman who barely existed on paper, an unknown number of children who did not exist on paper at all, the memory or possibly the presence of an old man whose death had no date, and a road grown shut behind all of them. It held a family that had spent 40 years teaching itself that the world ended at the mouth of the run. And the world, for its part, had agreed. The world had looked at that closed green road and decided there was nothing up it worth the climb, and had turned its attention to easier things and had forgotten. This is how children vanish in plain sight, not all at once, not by anyone's crime, by a slow mutual agreement between a family that wishes to be unseen and a county that is relieved to oblige. Every year that nobody went up the trace made it easier for the next year that nobody went up the trace. The not going became its own tradition, as solid as any road. And inside that long, soft silence, in a clearing the sun barely reached, 3 children were being raised on rules and stories no outsider had heard, by a household whose membership the outside world could not even count. The social worker, Della Frost, the one who came later and stayed longest with the eldest child, wrote a line in the margin of her notes that the clerk Marion Webb would read decades afterward in the courthouse basement and have to set down for a moment. Frost was not a fanciful woman. Her notes are the most level in the file. But somewhere in her second week she wrote in the margin, where she must have known it did not belong, that the children did not seem to understand they had been found. They behaved, she wrote, as though nothing had been interrupted, as though the deputy and the doctor and the state car at the bottom of the run were the strange visitors who would soon leave, and the hollow were the real and permanent world, still going on up there without them, with all its rules intact and all its household present. Including, she wrote, the one they kept naming, the one they spoke of as if he were waiting for them to come back up. She underlined that last part. We will get to why. But first, someone had to climb the trace. Someone had to walk up that closed green road on a cold, bright morning with no idea what the silence at the top of it had been protecting, or hiding, or keeping. Deputy Roy Mercer started up Calder Hollow a little after 9 in the morning, alone, on foot, and what he found in the clearing would take him the rest of his life to stop describing in his sleep. The first thing Roy Mercer noticed, before the cabin, before the children, before any of it, was the quiet. He had been raised in that country. He knew the particular noise of a working hollow, the dogs, the chickens, the far-off knock of an axe, the small, constant industry of people living off a place. Calder Hollow had none of it. He came up out of the green tunnel of the trace into the clearing and stopped at the edge of the trees, and the silence was so complete that he could hear the cold creek running somewhere below him in the rock and his own blood in his ears and nothing else. A lived-in place is never silent. This place was silent, and yet he would say it did not feel empty. It felt held. It felt the way a room feels when someone has just stopped talking because you walked in. He stood at the tree line longer than he liked to admit, looking at the clearing, before he made himself cross it. The clearing was not a ruin. That surprised him and unsettled him in a way he could not place at first. He had half expected on the walk up to find a collapsed cabin and an old grave and an empty hollow, the family long gone, the mail carrier's worry come to nothing but a sad story. Instead, he found a place that was being kept, poorly, strangely, by hands that clearly had little but kept. The cabin stood square, its chimney sound, a thin scrim of smoke standing straight up from it in the still air. There was a wash line with a few gray garments stiff on it in the cold. There was a garden plot dug and waiting for a season that had not yet come, the rows straight. There was a leaning barn, a dry well with a stone curb, and a few hens picking in the frozen mud who lifted their heads at him and went back to picking. Someone lived here. Someone had been living here all along. 3 miles up a road the county believed had closed, while the county believed no one was home. And then there was the cellar. It sat to the side of the cabin, set into the rise of the hillside, a low stone mouth with a heavy door of gray weathered planks fitted into it, the kind of root cellar every old homestead in that country had. There was nothing remarkable about a cellar. Mercer's eye went to it and went past it the first time. It was only later, when he came back to it, that he would understand why it had snagged at him even on that first pass, and he would not be able to look at it the same way again. We will come to the cellar door. It earns its own telling. For now it is only a detail in a clearing that was too quiet, a closed door among other closed doors, and Mercer walked past it toward the cabin to do the thing he had come to do, which was knock. He never got to knock. The cabin door opened before he reached it. A child stood in the gap. Mercer judged her the eldest of the ones he would find, a girl of maybe 12, though he was wrong about her age, as everyone would be wrong, because there was no way yet to be right. She was thin and clean in a worn dress, her hair plaited, and she looked at him without fear and without surprise, and without any of the things a child's face does when a stranger comes out of the woods into the only world she has ever known. She looked at him the way you look at the second visitor of the day, when you are not expecting even the first, mildly and a little bored, and waiting for him to state his business. That was the first thing that felt wrong, and Mercer wrote it down that very night in those words. Not that she was afraid, that she was not. He said something gentle. He never could remember exactly what, the kind of thing you say to a child to keep your own voice steady. And the girl, the eldest, the one whose name in the file is given as T-less, turned her head back into the dim of the cabin and said to someone inside that there was a man come up. She did not say it with any alarm. She said it the way a child announces a thing to a parent, expecting a parent to handle it, and Mercer waited for the parent. He waited for Verna Calder, or for the tall, courteous shape of an old man, or for whoever ran that household to come to the door and decide what he was. No one came. The girl looked back at him as if the matter were now settled, as if she had passed it up the chain and the chain had received it, and Mercer stood in the cold with his heart going hard, understanding slowly that the person she had spoken to was not going to appear, and that the girl did not find this strange in the least. There were 2 more children inside. He found them when the eldest stepped back and let him see into the one room of the cabin, and the sight of them is the thing he carried longest. A boy of perhaps 9 and a smaller child of perhaps 6, a girl the file calls Sari, sitting together near the hearth where the small fire burned. They were not bound, they were not hidden. They were not, he made very sure of this in the report, harmed in any way he could see. They were simply there, sitting in a clean swept room, and they turned their faces to him with the same calm the eldest had, three pale faces in the firelight turning toward the door, and none of them got up, and none of them cried out, and none of them ran. They looked at him. And the middle child, the boy, said the thing that broke the morning open. He asked Mercer politely if he had come down from the cellar. Mercer did not understand the question. He said no, that he had come up the trace, up from the run, and the boy looked at him with a small frown, the way you frown at someone who has gotten an easy thing wrong, and did not press it, and looked back at the fire. But the question sat in the room, down from the cellar, as if down from the cellar were a direction a person might reasonably come from. As if the cellar were not a hole in a hillside full of jars and roots, but a place above them somehow, a place people descended from, a part of the house that was lived in by someone who might, at any time, come down. Mercer would spend a long time afterward on that one preposition. Down, the child had said down. He did the things he was supposed to do. He asked where their mother was. He asked where the grown people were. He asked gently how long they had been alone, and at that question all three of them looked at him with a flat shared incomprehension, because the question contained a word alone that did not seem to mean to them what it meant to him. They were not alone, their faces said. Why would a man think they were alone? And when he asked, finally, the plain question, who else lived here, who else was up here with them, the eldest answered for all of them, and gave a name, and the two younger ones nodded, and that is the name Roy Mercer would carry back down the mountain and type 3 times into a report he did not believe even as he wrote it. He did not understand the name that first morning. It meant nothing to him yet. It was just a name a child said, and the unease he felt saying it back to himself was an animal unease ahead of his reason, the way you flinch from a shape in the dark before you have decided what it is. The name would come to mean a great deal. By the time the county doctor and the social worker and the sheriff had done their work, that name would be the most frightening word in the folder, not for what it was, but for who it had belonged to and for the dates that gathered around it like cold around a window. But that is the work of the sections to come. On the morning of the discovery it was only a sound, spoken by a calm child in a clean room, and Mercer wrote it down and felt the hair stand up on his arms and did not know why. He knew he could not leave them, that much was simple. Whatever was or was not up that hollow, 3 children could not stay in it alone, and he was not going to spend a night wondering about it. He told them as kindly as he could that they were going to come down with him just for a little while, just down to the town. And here came the only resistance he met all morning, and it was not the resistance he expected. None of the 3 was afraid to go with a stranger. What they did not want, what made the smallest one's face crumple for the first time, was to leave before they had told the household they were going. The eldest asked him with great seriousness whether they ought not to wait, because someone would want to know where they had gone. Someone would worry. It would not be right to simply leave without a word to the one who looked after them. And she glanced, when she said it, toward the cellar. Mercer followed her glance. He looked at the low stone mouth and the heavy gray door fitted into the hillside, and for the first time he made himself walk to it, because a lawman cannot stand in a clearing with 3 children and not open the one door that everyone keeps looking at. He crossed the frozen mud to the cellar, and he saw then the thing his eye had snagged on when he first came into the clearing and had not let himself register. The door was barred, but the bar was on the outside. A heavy timber dropped into 2 iron brackets, the way you bar a thing not to keep people out, but to keep something in. And the wood of the door around the edges low down was marked, scored, worn in long pale grooves, as if something on the inside had spent a great deal of time, over a great deal of time, trying to get out. Mercer stood at that barred and scored door with 3 calm children watching him from the cabin, in a clearing so quiet he could hear the hidden creek, and he understood that he was about to either open it or not open it, and that he would have to live with whichever he chose. He was not entirely alone for it, as it turned out, though he very nearly was. There was a second man partway up the trace that morning, a younger deputy named Calder, who had driven out with Mercer and been left at the bottom with the vehicle, and who, growing cold and curious, had started up the trace after him and caught up just at the edge of the clearing in time to see Mercer standing at the cellar door. Dovey is a minor figure in the file, mentioned in only a few places, but his small corroboration matters, because he is the only other adult who stood in that clearing on the first morning and saw it fresh, before anyone had decided what it meant. Dovey did not go all the way in. He stopped at the tree line the way Mercer had stopped at the tree line, held there by the same wrongness in the quiet, and from there he watched Mercer cross to the cellar, and he saw the children in the cabin doorway watching too, and he said, years later, that what he remembered was not the door and not the grooves, which he was too far back to see. What he remembered was the children's faces while Mercer approached the cellar. He said that the three of them, who had been calm as still water about everything else, about the stranger and the law and being told they would leave their home, grew, for the first time, attentive. Not frightened, attentive. The way children look when a guest is about to open the wrong door in a house, the door to the room where something private is kept, and they are waiting, with a kind of held breath, to see what the guest will do and whether they ought to stop him. The youngest, he said, took a step forward, as if to call out, and the eldest put a hand on her shoulder, and the two of them stood like that, watching Mercer's hand near the bar, the small one half forward and the big one holding her, and Dovey said the thing he could never shake was that they were not afraid for themselves. They were watchful on behalf of whatever was behind the door. As if the rudeness about to be done was to him, and they did not quite know how to warn a grown man that he was about to disturb someone at rest. Dovey went back down the trace before Mercer finished, on Mercer's order to radio in, and so he did not see what was behind the door either, and was glad of it. He served quietly in the county for years afterward and rarely spoke of the Calder morning, and when he did near the end, it was always that one image he returned to, the small child stepping forward and the older one's hand drawing her back, and the way the two of them had watched the cellar with the particular patience of children minding a sleeper, while a frightened deputy reached for a bar that was on the wrong side of the door. What he did at the cellar door that morning, and what he found or did not find behind it, is the hinge the whole case turns on, and he gave 3 different accounts of it across his life, and not one of them fully agreed with the others. We will give it the room it needs, but not yet. Because before the cellar gave up its answer, the children had to be brought down the mountain and set in a warm room and asked, one at a time, the simple questions, and it was in those first interviews, long before anyone went back up to that door, that the impossible thing first showed its shape, and the people of Lott County began, page by page, to lose their certainty about what kind of story they were in. They brought the children down the trace in the middle of the day, Mercer leading, the 3 of them walking after him in a quiet line, and the file notes that not one of them looked back at the clearing as it disappeared behind the trees. A child taken from the only home it has known looks back. These did not. They walked down out of the hollow as though they were running a short errand and would return by supper, and that composure, which should have been a mercy, was the first thing the people at the bottom of the run found that they could not get comfortable with. The children were taken to Cawley, to a county building that had a warm room and a woman to sit with them, and there they were kept while the machinery of the state was woken up. A doctor was sent for. The state was telephoned about placement, and it fell to 2 people over the first days to ask the children the simple necessary questions, who they were and how many and how long, and those 2 people were the county doctor, Howell Prout, and the social worker who arrived from the state, Della Frost. Between them they kept the careful early pages of the file, and it is in those pages that the impossible thing begins, not with a shock, but with a series of small wrong notes that take a while to add up to a chord. Prout saw them first because the children were thin and had been living rough, and someone had to make sure they were sound. He was a plain, kind, unimaginative man, a country doctor near the end of a long career, and the file is fortunate to have had him, because nothing in Howell Prout's nature inclined him toward the eerie. He examined the 3 children and found them, to his lasting relief, unhurt, underfed, weathered, but not abused, not in the ways he had braced himself for. He noted that they were healthier than children left alone had any right to be, which meant they had not been left alone, which meant someone had been feeding them and keeping them and minding them up in that hollow recently, and the question of who that someone was is the question Prout walked into the interviews already carrying. He asked the eldest, Tiles, who had been taking care of them, and she told him. She told him plainly, without hesitation, naming the person, and Prout wrote it down, and then he asked the same question of the boy in a separate sitting, and then of the small girl Sari, and all 3 of them named the same person, and described that person doing the ordinary things of a caretaker, fetching and cooking and minding the fire, and Prout's notes from those first sittings are almost cheerful, because he thought he had his answer. There was an adult. The adult had a name. The adult had stepped away or hidden or fled when the law came up the trace, but the adult was real and recent and could be looked for. That was the whole of it, Prout thought, a frightened guardian gone to ground. He was wrong, and the thing that began to show him he was wrong was small, and it was this. He asked the children where the person was now, and none of them could understand why the question was hard. The person was up at the hollow, of course, at the house, where else? And when Prout gently pointed out that the deputy had searched and found no adult up at the house, The children received this news not with fear for the missing guardian, not with the distress a child shows when a parent cannot be found, but with a kind of patient correction, as if Prout had simply not looked properly. The person was there. The person was always there. The person did not leave. You did not always see the person, the eldest explained, the way you do not always see someone who is in another part of the house, but the person was there, and would be there when they went back, and was very likely wondering, right now, where the three of them had gotten to. Prout wrote a single line after that sitting that the clerk Marion Webb would underline with her own pen decades later, without meaning to. He wrote that the child did not speak of the caretaker as missing. She spoke of the caretaker as left behind. That was the first wrong note. Here is the second. Della Frost arrived from the state to handle the placement, and she was a different instrument than Prout, sharper, more watchful, a woman who had sat across from a great many children in bad situations and learned to hear what they were not saying. She read Prout's notes, and she did the thing a good investigator does, which is to ask the same questions again, separately in her own way, to see whether the answers held. She expected them to wobble. Children's stories wobble. A frightened child repeating a story across days and questioners changes small things, forgets, embroiders, contradicts itself in the ordinary human way. That wobble is how you learn what is real and what is rehearsed. The Calder children did not wobble. Frost interviewed them apart on different days with no chance to confer, and she asked each of them about the person who had cared for them, and what she got back was not three versions of a story. It was one story told 3 times with the small specific agreements that do not come from rehearsal because they are too minor to rehearse. The way the person sat by the fire, leaning a certain way. A thing the person carried always that all 3 described the same. A particular thing the person said to them, a saying, the kind of worn family phrase that gets repeated until it loses meaning, and all 3 of them produced it, the same words, when asked what the person used to tell them. Frost noted that this in itself was not sinister. Children raised together in isolation by one caretaker would naturally share such things. That was reasonable. That was even comforting. What was not reasonable was when the agreements held across questions the children should not have been able to coordinate. Frost began, deliberately, asking each child something none of them could have anticipated and compared after because they were never together. She asked each child, separately, to tell her about the last time they had seen the person, not generally, the last specific time. What had the person been doing? What had they said? When was it? And the 3 accounts converged on a single recent moment, in close detail, a moment all 3 placed within the last days before the deputy came up the trace. All 3 put the person at the cellar. All 3 had the person say nearly the same thing to them. And all 3 asked when this was, gave answers that meant the same thing, that it had been recent, that it had been just before, that the person had been with them and speaking to them in the ordinary course of life, almost up to the very morning the deputy walked into the clearing. Frost checked this against herself 3 times before she would write it down, because she understood what she was holding. 3 children kept apart, independently describing a recent, specific, shared encounter with the same person, agreeing not in the way liars agree, which is broadly and defensively, but in the way witnesses agree, which is in the small, useless, true details that only people who were actually present together, recalling the same real event, ever share. By every measure she trusted, the children were telling the truth. Something had cared for them in that hollow, recently, attentively, and spoken to them, and they had all 3 been there for it. The trouble was the name. Because Frost, unlike Prout, had by then gone back through what little the county had on the Calder family, the thin paper trail, the old census, the courthouse fragments, the long memories down in Collie. She had been trying to find out who Verna Calder was and who the children's people were, and in doing so she had assembled, as well as anyone ever would, the rough shape of who had lived in that hollow and when. And when she set the name the children kept giving her against that shape, it did not fit. It did not fit at all. The name belonged to the family, certainly. It was a Calder name. But it was the name of someone who, by every date Frost could establish, by the census and the church roll and the memories of the oldest living people who had known that family, should have been long gone from that hollow before the eldest of these 3 children was ever born. The person the children described leaning by the fire, carrying the same thing, saying the same saying, the person they had all 3 seen recently at the cellar, the person they spoke of not as missing but as left behind and waiting, was a person who could not have been there to be seen. Frost did not write down that day what she suspected. She was too careful and too frightened of the shape of it to put it on paper yet. She wrote only the facts, the agreement of the accounts, the specificity, the dates that would not close. And in the margin where she must have known it did not belong, she wrote a question to herself, 3 words that Marian Webb would find decades later and read over more times than any other line in the file. Frost had written simply, "Who fed them?" Because that was the part that no theory could get around. A ghost story would have been easier. A ghost story Frost could have dismissed, could have filed under frightened children and the imagination of the isolated in the long dark of that hollow. But the children were alive, they were fed, they were healthy and minded and kept. Whatever had been up in Calder Hollow caring for 3 children through the winter had not been a story they told themselves. It had cooked, it had tended a fire. It had left a garden dug in straight rows for a spring it meant to see. Something with hands had kept those children alive, and every one of them, asked who, gave the name of a person the records insisted had been gone for longer than they had been breathing. Prout, when Frost finally showed him what she had built, the dates beside the name, did the thing the file records him doing in a single flat sentence that is somehow more frightening than any amount of description. The country doctor read it over twice, set it down, and said that the children's answers did not fit the world. Then he asked Frost not to let the sheriff hear her say the rest of it out loud, not yet, because once a thing like that is said out loud in a county like that one, it cannot be unsaid, and he wanted to be wrong, and he was afraid that they were going to go back up to that hollow and find out that they were not. They were going to go back up to the hollow, of course they were. There was a barred door scored on the inside, and a missing woman, and a name that broke the calendar, and no one in Lott County was going to be able to leave that cellar shut. But before the search there was one more interview, the one Della Frost had with the eldest girl alone, late, when the others were asleep, the one she almost did not record. In it the child said the single sentence that is the center of this entire case, the sentence the file is built around, the thing nobody could explain. And once you have heard it, nothing about Calder Hollow can be made to sit still again. It was late, and the other 2 children were asleep in the next room, and Della Frost sat with the eldest girl, Teles, in the warm room with the single lamp, and she was not, by her own account, conducting an interview at all. She had put her notes away. She had decided she was done for the day, that the child was tired, that pressing further would only frighten her. They were simply sitting, the way you sit with a child to let her settle before sleep, and Frost was talking gently about nothing, about the lamp, about the morning, about how the girl was safe now and looked after and need not worry. And it was the word looked after that did it. The girl turned her head and looked at Frost with something close to pity, the patient pity of a child who knows a thing a grown-up has failed to grasp, and she said the sentence that Frost would carry to the end of her life, and that sits, in Frost's own careful hand, in the middle of the Calder file. The girl said that Frost did not need to look after them, because someone already did, and that he was not angry that they had been taken down the mountain, because he had told them before the deputy ever came that men would come up the trace and carry them off for a little while, and that they were to go along quietly and not be afraid, because he would still be there when they came back, the same as always, because he did not leave, and he had never left, not when the old ones went. Not when the road closed, not when the woman went, and he would not leave for this either. Frost asked her very carefully who had told her that. And the girl said the name, the 4th name, the name that broke the calendar. And then she said the thing that is the true center of the case, the detail that stopped the investigation cold, and it was not a frightening image, and it was not a scream in the dark, it was a date. The child asked how she knew the person had foretold the deputy's coming, said that he had told them so on a particular evening, and she described that evening, the weather of it, the small, ordinary things of it, with the flat precision Frost had learned to trust. And the evening she described, the recent evening, the one just before the discovery, the one on which the caretaker had sat with the 3 of them by the fire, and calmly told them that men would come, and that they should go along and that he would wait, that evening fell on a date that was, by every record Frost had assembled, decades after the person who said it could possibly have spoken. That was the sentence, that was the thing nobody could explain. Not a vision, not a shadow on the wall. A child placing a real, dated, recent conversation in the mouth of someone who on that date was supposed to have been gone from the world for longer than the child had been alive. And telling it not as a ghost story, not with the relish of a frightened child performing fear, but as the plainest fact of her life, the way you might say your father told you something last Tuesday. The horror of it was the ordinariness. The child was not haunted. The child was reporting. Frost did one more thing that night that she almost wished afterward she had not. She asked the girl to describe him, not to name him again. To describe him the way you would describe anyone, his height, his hands, his voice, the way he moved across a room. And the girl did easily fondly, the way a child describes a grandparent, and the description that came out was of a tall, spare, courteous old man, slow-spoken, who carried a particular thing always and sat leaning a particular way and said a particular worn saying, and it matched, point for point, the few surviving accounts of Elias Calder that Frost had gathered from the oldest people in Collie, people who had met the man face to face decades before this child was born. The child had described a man she could not have met, and she had described him correctly. Frost sat with that for a long time, she wrote, before she could make her hand move again. And when it moved, it wrote down the date the child had given, and beside it, the dates that made the date impossible, and she looked at the two of them sitting next to each other on the page, the recent evening and the long-gone person, and she understood that she had crossed out of the kind of case that gets solved and into the kind that gets sealed. Because here is what the investigation had, laid out plainly, at its worst hour. It had 3 children kept apart, who agreed in the manner of true witnesses about a 4th person in the household. It had a 4th person whose name was a real Calder name, attached by every available record to someone who should have left that hollow before any of the children were born, by death or by departure. The records could not even say which, and that uncertainty was itself part of the horror, because the man's leaving of the world had never been written down. Elias Calder, the old patriarch who closed the road, the man with no death date, the blank the case had fallen into. The children's caretaker, the one who did not leave, who had not left when the old ones went, who waited at the cellar and foretold the law and minded the fire, bore his name and his face and his way of sitting and his saying. And no one could prove he was dead, because no one had ever been able to prove when he died, because he had spent his life making himself unaccountable, and his death had obeyed the same rule. And it had undeniably 3 living, fed, healthy children, which meant that the question who fed them had a real answer, a physical answer, someone with hands and a fire and a garden, and the only name anyone could attach to that answer was the impossible one. 2 facts: the children were telling the truth could not be true. The whole file lives in the space between those 2 sentences, and the people who kept it spent 11 months unable to make that space close, and at last decided, rather than close it, to bury it. Prout went through it the way a doctor goes through a diagnosis he does not want, eliminating, and the file preserves him doing it, and watching him do it is the most unbearable part of the middle of this story, because he was the least fanciful man in the county, and he could not make the explanations hold. The children were lying, that was the first one and the easiest, and he let it go first. Liars do not agree the way these children agreed. He had taken statements from frightened, coached, lying children before, and their stories were broad where they should be specific and specific where they should be vague, and they fell apart under exactly the kind of separate, patient questioning that Frost had done. These statements did the opposite. They were careless about the things liars guard and precise about the things liars never think to invent. They were, in every technical particular Prout knew how to test, the statements of people telling the truth. The children were deluded. That was the second, and it lasted longer because isolation does strange things, and 3 children raised alone in a dark hollow by strange rules might well share one fixed belief, one family ghost they had all been taught to feel. Prout held onto that one for days. And then he set it down because a shared delusion does not split kindling, and does not bank a fire to last a winter night, and does not dig a garden in straight rows for a spring it intends to see, and someone had done all of those things recently up in that hollow, and the someone was not a belief. Belief has no hands. The children had been kept alive by something with hands. The records were wrong. That was the third, and it was the one everybody prayed for, Prout and Frost and eventually the sheriff too, because it was the only one that let the world stay the world. The records were wrong, and the caretaker was simply a living Calder the county had never counted, some surviving brother or cousin or son of Elias, an ordinary unaccounted man hiding up that hollow, who had run when the law came and would be found when they searched. That was the explanation the whole back half of the investigation was built to confirm. They went up that trace again hoping to find an ordinary frightened man, because an ordinary frightened man would have given them back the world. Or Prout wrote, and then he did not finish the sentence. The file has the word or and a space and nothing after it. The country doctor came to the edge of the 4th explanation and would not write it down. that blank, that unfinished, or is the truest thing Howell Prout ever put on paper, and Marion Webb, finding it decades later in the basement, said it was the place she finally stopped reading for the day and went up into the daylight to be among other people. There was one more thing, and it belongs here at the peak, because it is the moment the impossible stopped being a matter of testimony and reached out and touched the physical world, just once, lightly enough. When Frost finally compared her separate interviews in full, she found that all three children, describing that last evening by the fire, the evening the caretaker foretold the law, had mentioned the same small detail in passing, a detail so minor that none of them thought to emphasize it, which is exactly why it mattered. They each said that the caretaker, before he told them the men were coming, had come up from the cellar. Down from the cellar, the boy had said to Mercer in the clearing, that wrong preposition that had snagged the deputy on the first morning. The children did not experience the cellar as below them. They experienced it as the place the caretaker dwelt, the place he descended from to sit with them and ascended back into when he was done, and on that last evening he had come up from it to give them their instructions, and gone back down into it after. And the cellar, when Mercer found it, was barred from the outside, with a heavy timber dropped into iron brackets, and scored low on the inside of the door in long pale grooves, as if something had spent a very long time trying to come up. Frost asked the youngest, Sari, one more question about the cellar, almost in passing on a different day, to see whether the detail would hold or break. She asked the little girl who barred the door and from which side and why. And the child explained it the way a child explains a household chore so familiar it has stopped having a reason. They barred it from the outside, she said, at night and when they were away from the house, the way you were supposed to, the way they had always done it, the way he had taught them to. They barred him in, and they did it, the child said, not so that he could not get out. They did it so that he would not have to, so that he could rest, so that he would be there, waiting, the same as always, when they unbarred it in the morning and he came up. The investigation had been telling itself up to that night that it was looking for a missing adult. After that night it understood that it was not looking for a missing adult. It was looking at a barred door in a clearing the sun barely reached, that three children believed someone came up from, that three children had been taught since infancy to bar shut for his sake, and it had to decide whether to open it, and what it would mean if the door was empty, and what it would mean, far worse, if it was not. They went back up the trace, they searched the hollow against everything the children had said, and the search is the strange, hollow, anticlimactic heart of the back half of this story, because the property answered none of the questions and quietly made all of them worse. But that is the next part. What matters here at the center, the highest wave, is only this. On a winter night in 1977, in a warm room with one lamp, a calm child set a recent date beside a long-dead name, described a face she could not have seen and described it true, and did not understand why the woman across from her had gone so still. And in that stillness the Calder case stopped being a case the law could close and became the thing it remains, a sealed folder, soft at the corners from handling, with an unfinished sentence in it where a doctor came to the edge of an explanation and chose, instead, to leave the world a blank. They went up the trace the second time in numbers, which tells you something about what that first morning had done to Roy Mercer. He had walked up alone on a mail carrier's hunch. He went back with the sheriff, with two more men, with the county doctor, and with a state investigator who had come down to look at the placement and stayed because the placement had turned into something else. 6 people climbed the closed green road to a clearing that one frightened deputy had stood in by himself a few days before, and the fact that it took 6 of them to feel safe in an empty hollow is the first thing the file records about the search, and it is not nothing. The clearing was exactly as Mercer had left it. That unsettled them too, though they could not have said why. Somewhere in each of them had been the expectation that the place would have changed, that whoever had run from the deputy would have come back, that there would be smoke again or a light or a sign of life, or alternately that the whole thing would have collapsed into obvious abandonment and shown itself a sad ordinary tragedy after all. Neither happened. The cabin stood. The cold hearth held gray ash. The garden waited in its straight-dug rows. The wash still hung stiff on the line. The hens had scattered into the brush. It was a place that had been left in the middle of its own ongoing life, paused as if everyone had stepped out for a moment and meant to come right back, and the only thing missing from it was people. They searched the cabin first, and the cabin gave them the children's lives in miniature and almost nothing else. One room, swept plain, a few pallets, a table, a shelf of jars, the small, poor inventory of a household living close to the bone. There was a family Bible, and it is the most important object they found, because it is the thing that finally gave the children names and ages the records had denied them. Births were written in it in a long hand going back generations, and the 3 children were there near the bottom in a newer ink, 3 entries that let Prude at last fix their ages with something like confidence. The eldest was 12, the boy was 9, Sari was 6. The investigators had guessed close, and the confirming of it should have been a comfort, the small human relief of finally knowing who these children were. It was not a comfort because of what else was written on that page. Above the children's names, the same long hand had recorded the family's deaths, the way old Bibles do, and the deaths were there, going back, and among them in that same hand was the death of Elias Calder. A name, a year, the hand had written it down. Someone in that household had recorded the old man's death in the family book in ink, which meant someone in that household had known he was dead, had marked it, had mourned it in the old plain way. And the year written beside his name was years before the eldest child was born. It was the date the county had never been able to find, and there it had been all along up in the cabin in the Bible, waiting. Elias Calder was dead, the book said so, the family's own hand said so, he had been dead the whole time. And his name was the name the children had given, every one of them, for the man who minded their fire and came up from the cellar and foretold the law and told them not to be afraid. The Bible did not close the case. The Bible made it worse because it removed the last comfortable explanation. The records were not wrong. The records agreed with the family's own book. There was no unaccounted living Calder hiding up that hollow. There was a dead man recorded as dead by the very children who insisted he had spoken to them last week. The thing the search had gone up the mountain to find, an ordinary living adult, was not there to be found, and the family's own Bible was the document that proved it could not be. So they searched harder because that is what you do. If there was a living person feeding 3 children, that person had to eat and sleep and leave traces, and the men went over that clearing looking for the signs of an ordinary adult life lived alongside the children's, a second set of everything, and they did not find it. There were 3 pallets sized for the children and no fourth. There were portions at the hearth for 3. The garden's yield, what they could reckon of it, fed 3. Everywhere they looked for the caretaker's physical life, the life that must exist if the caretaker were a living man, they found instead a household arranged for 3, and only 3, with the 4th present everywhere in the children's speech and nowhere in the evidence of plates and beds and worn places. It was as if the household had been keeping a person who did not need keeping. Set a place the children had. There had been a 4th place laid at the table the first morning. Mercer had seen it. But the food, when you counted it, fed 3. They laid a place for him. They did not feed him. And no one wanted to say aloud what that arrangement implied, a place set for someone who did not eat. That left the cellar. They had all been not looking at it the whole time, the way you do not look at the one thing you came for, and at last there was nothing else to search, and the sheriff, Adrian Tate, was the one who walked to it, because he was the senior man and the bar was on the outside and it was his to lift. The file is sparse here, deliberately, I think. Tate lifted the timber out of the iron brackets. The grooves were there, low on the inside face, pale and long, just as Mercer had reported, and the men looked at them and did not discuss them. And Tate opened the cellar door. What was inside is the place the file goes quietest, and I am going to honor that quiet, because the men who were there honored it, and because the truth is that the cellar did not give them an answer. It gave them an absence shaped like an answer, which is worse. There was no one in the cellar. Of course there was no one in the cellar. It was a root cellar, stone-walled, cold, low, with shelves and jars and the earth smell of such places, and it was empty of any living person, and that emptiness should have been the end of it, the deflating ordinary end, the barred door opening on nothing but turnips and dark. But it was not the end, because the cellar was not quite empty of everything. There was a place in it at the back, away from the shelves, where the dirt floor was worn smooth and low in the shape of where a person sits or rests or stays, the way a floor wears under long use. Something had spent time at the back of that cellar, a great deal of time, the kind of time that shapes packed earth. And around that worn place the men found the small, ordinary leavings of someone's long occupancy, a folded thing, a kept thing, the worn, poor belongings of a person who had, by every appearance, lived down there, in the cold and the dark, behind a door barred from the outside, for longer than the smoothing of that floor could be quickly accounted for. They did not find a body. I want to be plain about that, because the absence of a body is the whole point. A body they could have explained. A body would have been a tragedy with a name and a cause, terrible and ordinary, a thing the law knows how to hold. they found no body. They found a worn place and some kept belongings and a barred door and a long cold silence, the physical shape of a presence with the presence removed, and 3 children up at the bottom of the mountain who said the presence was alive and well and waiting, and would be there when they came home. Experts were brought up quietly over the following weeks because Tate did not want a circus and the county could not afford one. The file mentions them only obliquely, men brought in to look at the worn floor, the grooves, the kept things, to say something sensible, and the file records with a kind of weariness that one could not date the smoothing of the floor with any confidence. Another looked at the grooves on the door and would say only that they were consistent with long wear and would not say by what. A third was brought to talk to the children and came away, the file says, asking to be released from the matter, which is a remarkable thing for the file to record about a man whose whole purpose was to explain children. Every expert who went up that trace went up to close a door and came down having opened another, and one by one Tate stopped sending for them, because they were not narrowing the thing. They were widening it. Each careful professional answer turned out to be another I cannot say, and a county can only absorb so many of those before the not saying becomes the official position by default. And through all of it, the one practical question, the only one that should have had a flesh and blood answer, sat in the middle of the search untouched and grew. Who fed them? Della Frost had written it in the margin and it had not gone away. 3 children had come down off that mountain healthy. The food up there fed 3. The garden was dug for 3. There was no 4th pallet, no 4th portion, no sign of an adult's daily life. By every physical measure the search produced, no one had been up in that hollow but the children. And by every word the children spoke, someone had been up there with them their whole lives, had raised them, had fed them, had taught them to bar the cellar at night so that he could rest, and had told them, on a recent dated evening, not to be afraid of the men who were coming. The search was supposed to settle it. Instead, the search did the thing that turns an investigation into a sealed file. It removed every comfortable explanation and supplied no other. It proved the records right and the family's own Bible right and the calendar right and the children, somehow also right all at once in a way that could not all be true, and it left the men of Locke County standing in a cold clearing they did not want to be standing in, having opened the one door they had been afraid to open, and found behind it not a monster and not a corpse and not a relief, but a worn place in the dirt and a long silence and the unbearable sense, which none of them wrote down but all of them carried back down the mountain, that they had opened the door at the wrong time of day. That whatever the children meant by come up from the cellar, they had come and barred it back in daylight in numbers with a doctor present and found it empty, and that the children had been very clear that you did not always see him, that sometimes the place was simply empty and he was there all the same and would be there in the evening when it was time to come up. They barred the cellar again when they left. Tate did it himself, dropped the timber back into the brackets on the outside the way it had been, and not one of the 6 men asked him why he was barring an empty room, and not one of them told him to stop. They barred it the way the children had taught them without meaning to learn it, and they walked down the trace in the failing light, and behind them the clearing went on with its paused, ongoing, peopleless life, the cold hearth and the straight rows and the stiff wash and the barred door, waiting, the file says, the same as always. It was on the walk down in the last of the light that Adrian Tate first said the word seal, not as a decision, as a wish. He said it half to himself that some things ought to just be sealed, and Prout heard him and wrote it down, and that is where the next part of the story begins, with a sheriff frightened enough to want a thing buried, and a doctor honest enough to know that burying it would not make it not have happened. The decision to seal the Calder file was not made in a single room on a single day, though the paperwork makes it look that way. The paperwork is clean. There is an order and a case number with that strange letter after it, and the signature of Judge Purnell, and a date in 1978, and if all you had was the order, you would think the matter had been handled briskly and sensibly by serious men. What the rest of the file shows, in its margins and its memos and its few preserved disagreements, is that the sealing took the better part of a year, and that it was not sensible at all, and that the men who did it were not agreed, and that at least one of them fought it to the end and lost. The one who wanted it sealed was Sheriff Adrian Tate, and it is worth being fair to him because it would be easy to make him the villain, and he was not a villain. He was a practical man holding a thing that practicality could not hold. He had a county to run, a county of living people with ordinary troubles, and he had a case that produced no body, no crime he could name, no suspect he could charge, no explanation he could speak aloud without sounding like a man who had lost his reason. He had 3 children who needed homes and a story attached to them that, if it ever got out, would follow them for the rest of their lives and turn them from children who needed help into a freak show the whole country would come to gawk at. Tate's instinct to bury the thing was not only fear, though it was fear. It was also in part a kind of mercy, or he told himself it was, and the two are hard to separate in the file and were probably hard to separate in the man. The one who fought it was Della Frost, and her fight is the moral center of the back half of this story. She did not believe, necessarily, in the impossible thing. The file is careful to show that she never wrote down a supernatural conclusion, never once committed to paper that anything other than the natural world was at work in Calder Hollow. What she believed in was the record. She had spent her career on children who were failed by people who decided it was easier not to know, and she saw, in Tate's wish to seal, the oldest and most ordinary evil she knew, which is not the monster in the cellar but the official who decides that a thing is too much trouble to be true. She argued that whatever had happened up there, it had happened to 3 living children, and that sealing the file did not protect the children, it protected the county from having to keep looking, and that those were not the same thing and should never be allowed to wear the same coat. Their disagreement runs through the file as a quiet, bitter correspondence, memo against memo, and it is painful to read because both of them are partly right. Tate is right that no good comes of the story getting out. Frost is right that no good comes of pretending the story did not happen. And in between them sits the thing itself, the unexplained center, which neither sealing nor pursuing could change, because the children had said what they said, and the floor was worn the way it was worn, and the Bible recorded what it recorded, and all the memos in the world could not make those facts agree or make them go away. What broke the stalemate was not an argument, it was the simple grinding pressure of time and of a county that wanted to be done. The investigation had nowhere left to go. Every thread ended in the same "I cannot say." You cannot keep an open investigation open forever on a foundation of things no one can say, and Tate knew it, and Frost knew it too, however much she hated it. The experts had stopped giving answers. The search had been done and redone. The children could not be questioned indefinitely, and Frost herself would not have allowed it, because the one principle she never bent on was that the children were not specimens. And so the case did what such cases do. It did not get solved, and it did not get closed. It got sealed, which is the thing a county does when it cannot bear either to finish a thing or to keep carrying it, and Judge Purnell signed the order, and the gray folder went into a box with a letter after its number, and the basement took it. But before the children pass out of the active story, the file does one decent thing, and it is the part Frost fought hardest for and won. It tells us, a little, what became of them. They were not, as you might fear, scattered to the wind and lost. Frost saw to that, or saw to as much of it as she could. The 3 Calder children were placed, the file says, separately in different homes in different parts of the state under different names, and that separation was deliberate and was Frost's own recommendation, and it is the one place in the entire folder where you can feel her making a hard choice and standing behind it. She separated them on purpose. She believed and wrote that whatever held those children together held them inside the thing that had happened in the hollow, and that their only chance at an ordinary life was to be grown apart from one another and apart from the shared world they had been raised in, the world with the 4th person in it. She was trying to break the spell, if it was a spell, by the only means a social worker has, which is paperwork and distance and the slow, ordinary erosion of a new and different life. Whether it worked, the file mostly does not say, because once the children were placed under new names, the file lost the right to follow them, and Frost, to her credit, did not abuse that right. But there is one note late, and it is the last thing in the active file before the seal, and it is the thing that tells you Frost was never sure she had done the right thing, or even a thing that was possible. She went to see the eldest, Teles, some months after the placement, the only follow-up the file records her making. The girl was settled by then in a new home with a new name in a new town beginning, Frost hoped, to become someone the hollow could not reach. And Frost asked her gently, the way she had learned to, whether she still thought about the man who had cared for them, whether she missed him, whether in this new and ordinary place she still believed he was up there waiting. And the girl, the file says, looked at Frost with a calm that was no longer quite the calm of the hollow, a calm that had learned a little of the world's worry in the months between, and said that she did not have to think about it because it was not a matter of thinking. He was there, he did not leave. She had told them that before, and it was still true, and the only thing that had changed was that now she was the one who was away and not him. And then she said the thing Frost wrote down last, and underlined the way she had underlined before, the thing that closed the active file on a note no seal could quite press flat. The girl said that she was not worried about being far from him, because distance had never been the thing that mattered. He had been far from the old ones too, she said, the ones in the Bible, the ones long gone, and it had not stopped him being with them. Being gone, she said, the way the grown-ups meant it, the way Frost meant it when she said the man was gone, was not a thing that kept him from anyone. It never had been. That was the whole point of him. That was what the children had been trying to explain patiently to every frightened adult who asked, since the morning the deputy came up the trace. He did not leave when people were gone. Being gone was where he did his waiting. Frost closed the file. She did not write anything after that. There was nothing to write that would not have been either a denial she did not believe or an admission she could not make, and she was too honest for the first and too careful for the second. And so she left it, the girl's words and then the white space and then the order of seal, and that is how the active investigation of the Calder children ends, not with a finding, but with a child kindly explaining to a grown woman that the grown woman had misunderstood the nature of absence. And the grown woman having no answer, and the county dropping the timber into the brackets on the whole affair the way Tate had dropped it on the cellar from the outside to keep something at rest. The seal held for decades. The men who knew the case grew old and most of them died. Tate died. Prout died. Mercer lived a long time and talked when he talked in those three accounts that never fully matched. The box sat in the basement with its soft corners getting softer, taken out and read and put back by people we cannot now name, more than almost any other file down there, which is its own small mystery, all those hands over all those years on a thing that was supposed to be closed. And then a county clerk named Marion Webb, working alone in the basement on a digitizing grant, lifted a lid off a box marked with a year and a number and a letter she had never seen, and found a paper seal signed by a long-dead judge, and felt her hands go still, and decided, against every sensible instinct, to read what serious men had spent a year deciding the world was better off not knowing. What she found in those pages we have mostly now told, but not all of it, because a sealed file is not the end of a thing in a county like that one. Things leak. Old men talk near the ends of their lives. A deputy gives an account, and then a different account, and then a third. A social worker keeps a private note she was never supposed to keep. And in the years since Marion Webb opened that box, a little of what was sealed has come back out into the light in pieces from the few who were there and lived long enough to speak. And what those last witnesses said, near the ends of their own lives, about Calder Hollow and the man who waited in the cellar and the children who were not afraid, is the last thing this story has to give, and it does not close the door. It only tells you finally and quietly why the door was barred from the outside, and who it was barred for, and why no one who understood the case ever volunteered to go back up that trace alone. What leaked slowly, the way water finds its way out of a sealed room, not through any single failure but through 100 small ones over a long time. A sealed file in a small county is not a vault, it is a held breath, and breath cannot be held forever. Over the decades, the Calder case came back into the light in pieces, from the few who had been there, and the pieces never quite assembled into a whole, which is itself the most honest thing about them, because the case never assembled into a whole either. We have those pieces now and Marion Webb's reading of the folder, and between them we can stand at the end of this story and see almost all of it. Almost. The center stays dark. The center was always going to stay dark. That is what it means for a thing to be sealed, and not only by a judge. Roy Mercer was the one who talked the most near the end. The way the first man up a thing is often the one who cannot finally keep it. He was an old man by the time he gave the accounts that survive, and he gave 3 of them to 3 different people, and they do not match, and the not matching is not the unreliability of an old memory. It is something else. In each account the clearing is the same, and the silence is the same, and the children are the same, calm and unafraid in the firelight. What changes from telling to telling is the cellar door. In one account, Mercer says he never opened it that first morning, that he barred his own nerve against it and waited for the others. In another, he says he lifted the bar and looked and saw nothing and barred it back. And in the third, the last one, given to the person he seems to have trusted most, near the very end of his life, he says something he says in neither of the others, which is that he did open it that first morning alone and that the cellar was empty, and that as he stood there in the cold stone dark looking at the worn place at the back of it, he had the absolute and unshakable certainty that he was not the only one in the room, and that whatever shared it with him was patient. and was not troubled by him, and was waiting for an hour that was not this hour. And he barred the door, he said, and he never told anyone because there was nothing to tell. An empty room, a feeling, a grown man's nerves up a dark hollow, that is all it was. He said that last part, the witness reported, with the particular insistence of a man who has spent 40 years failing to believe himself. Howell Prout never talked, but Prout wrote, and one piece of what he wrote came out long after his death, a letter not part of the official file, in which the country doctor set down the thing he would not write in the folder, the thing after the unfinished, or he did not, even in the letter, name the fourth explanation outright. He was incapable of it to the end. What he wrote instead was a kind of confession of method. He wrote that a doctor is trained to find the explanation that requires the fewest new things to be true, that this is the whole of the art, to prefer the diagnosis that disturbs the world the least. And he wrote that the Calder case was the only time in his long life that the explanation requiring the fewest new things to be true was also the one he could not say, and that he had lain awake understanding slowly over months that the simplest account of the facts, the one that added the least, the one a clean mind would reach for first, was not the comfortable one. It was the other one. The children agreed because they were telling the truth. The floor was worn because something wore it. The man was gone because he was gone, and was there because he did not let being gone stop him. Every fact taken plainly pointed one way, and the only thing standing against it was Prout's wish, and a wish, he wrote, is not a finding. He signed the letter and put it away, and it outlived him, and that is the closest the case ever comes to a conclusion, an old doctor admitting that the frightening answer was also the simplest, and refusing, all the same, to write it down. Della Frost outlived nearly all of them, and Frost at the end said the least, which is in keeping with everything she was. She was asked once late by someone who had heard a version of the story and tracked her down, whether she believed there had been something in that cellar. And Frost, the careful one, the one who never once wrote a supernatural word, gave an answer that is the truest sentence in the whole long aftermath. She said that she did not know what was in the cellar, and that she had decided long ago it was the wrong question, and that the right question, the one that had kept her up for 40 years, was simpler and worse. The right question, Frost said, was not what was in the cellar, it was who fed the children. She had asked it on the first day and written it in the margin, and she had never once, in all the years since, heard an answer that was both possible and true. Someone fed those children. Someone real with hands kept 3 small people alive through a winter in a hollow where the search found no fourth pallet and no fourth plate, and no second life lived alongside theirs. Either that is impossible, Frost said, or it is true, and she had held both of those for 40 years and could not put either one down, and she supposed she would die holding them, and she did. There is one more witness, and he is the one the story began with, and it is right that he should also be near its end. Estill Combs, the mail contractor, the man whose nagging sense of an absence sent a reluctant deputy up a closed road, lived a long, quiet life afterward and almost never spoke of his part in it, and when he finally did, near the end, he did not talk about the children or the cellar or the file, because he had never seen any of those things. He talked about the run. He said that for years after, he kept his route the same, kept driving past the mouth of Hare's Run a few times a week the way he always had, and that he never once stopped there again, and never once looked up it longer than he had to, because of a thing he could not justify and never tried to. He said that before 1977, the mouth of that run had felt like the bottom of an empty thing, a closed hollow with nobody home, sad the way all those emptying hollows were sad. And that after, it did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. Nothing had changed up there that he could see, the trace still grown shut, the family gone, the cabin dark. But the run had stopped feeling abandoned and started feeling tended, the way a house with one lit window feels different from a house with none, except there was no window and no light, only the certainty, every time he drove past, that the hollow above him was not as empty as it had been when there were actually people in it. He retired off that route eventually. He said it was the only part of the job he was glad to put down. Marion Webb, for her part, did one thing after she closed the folder that she did not have to do and never told the county about. Some weeks later, on her own time, she drove out toward that part of the county, toward the run, not meaning to go up anything, just to see the place on a map made real. She got as far as the bottom. She said the trace was right where the file said it would be, a green seam in the brush climbing the ridge, grown over but unmistakably still a way up, the way the eldest girl had insisted it would still be there. And she said she stood at the bottom of it for a while in the afternoon light with the fog already starting to gather higher up, and that she had every intention, driving out there, of walking up it, because she was a practical woman, and she wanted to see an empty clearing and a fallen cabin, and put the whole thing to rest in daylight. And that she got out of the car and looked up the trace and got back in and drove home, and could not afterward give a single sensible reason why, except that the stillness at the top of it had not felt like the stillness of an empty place. It had felt, she said, like patience. And she had thought, standing there, of a child's voice in a file in a basement, explaining that being gone was where he did his waiting, and she had decided that some things you confirm by leaving them alone. And the children, people always want to know about the children, and the honest answer is that we mostly do not know, because Frost protected them well, separated them, renamed them, scattered them into ordinary lives the Hollow could not reach, and the seal helped her do it, which is the one good thing the seal ever did. They grew up, presumably. They became adults somewhere under names that were not Calder, in towns that had never heard of Calder Hollow. It is likely that some of them are living still, ordinary and elderly and unrecognizable, and if they are, then they have earned their quiet, and this telling will not take it from them, which is why no real name in this account is one they would know, and why the Hollow itself sits in a county you will not find on a map. That much is owed to them. They were children, they were not a monster, and they were not a hoax. They were three small people who were raised by something, and who came down off a mountain and told the truth as they knew it to every adult who asked, patiently, kindly, and were not believed, and were separated, and were sent out into a world that had decided their whole childhood was a thing best left unexplained. Whatever else this story is, it is that first. It is about three children no one believed. But the cold open made a promise, and the promise has to be paid, so here at the end is the line, the most unsettling line in the folder. The one Marion Webb found in the basement and could not get out of her head, the one that sits in the file in Della Frost's careful hand, recorded from the eldest girl and never explained by anyone. When Frost asked Teles that last time in the new town under the new name, whether the man would not be lonely up there now that the children were gone, now that the Hollow was empty and the cabin was dark and there was no one left for him to wait for, the girl had looked at her with that calm and corrected her gently one more time, the way she had been correcting frightened grown-ups since the morning the deputy came. She said he was not waiting for the children. She said she was sorry that Frost had thought so all this time, because it must have made the whole thing harder to understand. He had never been waiting for the children. The children had only been the ones who were there. He was waiting, the girl said, the way he had always waited, the way he had waited through the old ones and the closed road and the woman who went, the way he would go on waiting in that cellar in that hollow long after the last of them had grown old and died somewhere far away. He was not waiting for anyone in particular, he was simply waiting, and he was very, very good at it. And the trace was still there, she said, grown over but still there, the way a thing is still there even when no one walks it, and the door would open from the inside the moment anyone ever lifted the bar and forgot in the dark which way the wearing on the wood was facing. That is the line, that is the thing nobody could explain. Not a description, not a sighting, not a body. A child in a safe, warm house far from the mountain, calmly explaining to a kind woman that the man in the cellar had never needed anyone to be there and was there still and would keep. And then asking, the file says, with the first and only thing resembling worry the girl ever showed, whether the men who searched the Hollow had remembered to bar the door again when they left. They had. Adrian Tate had done it himself, dropped the timber back into the brackets from the outside, the way the children taught him without knowing he was being taught. The file is clear on that. The door was barred when they left. It is presumably barred now, on a dark cellar in an empty clearing at the top of a trace no one walks, in a hollow the fog still pools in a county that sealed the whole thing away and tried, the way counties do, to let the not knowing become a kind of knowing, a kind of peace. The cabin is surely gone or going, the roof open to the weather by now, the garden long swallowed, the wash line down. But the cellar is stone, and stone keeps, and the bar is oak, and oak keeps, and the worn place at the back of the dirt floor is the kind of thing that does not unwear. Marion Webb closed the folder the last morning and carried it back to its box and put the lid on and did not digitize it. That detail is hers, and it is the right ending. She had a grant and a scanner and a list, and she left the Calder file off the list and put it back in the dark where serious men had decided it belonged, not because she believed them, but because she had read every page and found that she agreed, for a reason she could not have given them and they would not have understood. She left it sealed because the children, wherever they were owed their quiet, and because some questions do not want answering so much as they want barring gently from the outside, by someone who has understood at last that the wearing on the wood faces in. If you ever find yourself in that country, in one of those close blind hollows where the sun comes late and the fog does not burn off, and you come across an old grown-over trace climbing a ridge, with a stillness at the top of it that feels less like emptiness and more like patience, The kindest thing you can do is what the people of Locke County finally did. Leave it barred, do not lift it to sea. And do not, whatever you do, go up alone. If this story stayed with you, there is another one waiting, a different hollow, a different sealed thing on the screen now, and it is the one most people watch next.